Welcome to this evening's keynote address. I hope you had a wonderful day. I've had an incredible day. I've learned so much from all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome Thom van Dooren to give a keynote entitled Moving Birds in Hawaii, Assisted Colonization in a Colonized Land. So Thom van Dooren is Associate Professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies and the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. His research and writing focus on some of the many philosophical, ethical, cultural, and political issues that arise in the context of species extinctions and human entanglements with threatened species and places. He is the author of Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction, The Wake of Crows, Living and Dying in Shared Worlds, and co-editor with Deborah Bird-Rose and Matthew Trulou of Extinction Studies, Stories of Time, Death, and Generations, all published by Columbia University Press. You can find more about him at thomvandooren.org. So please welcome Thom van Dooren.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to Sarah and Bob and everyone at the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre for the invitation, for all of you for coming along. It's been a wonderful first day and I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that the story that I want to share with you this afternoon, is rooted in the life-giving, dynamic lands and seas of the Hawaiian Islands, and acknowledge that the indigenous people of these islands, the Kānaka Maoli, who have long been weaving their own stories into and out of these places. So, the story I'd like to share with you today is that of the Nihoa Millerbird, which makes its home in the remote Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It is, to borrow the words of Sheila Conan, a biologist who's been working on the Nihoa Millerbird for much of her life, the story of a tiny population of a tiny bird on a tiny island where almost no one is ever going to go. More specifically, this story centres on efforts to protect the future of this species through a program of assisted colonisation. That is, by establishing a new population in another place, in this case on another island. This is a work of remainders, of holding open space in the world. In these Anthropocenic times, what would it mean to do this kind of work well? Of course, there are no simple answers, but my focus here rests on a concerted effort to situate assisted colonisation inside the larger processes of both connection and disconnection, of worlding and unworlding that in very different ways shape the lives of diverse peoples, plants and animals in Hawaii. I take up this situating work through an attentiveness to the possibilities opened up and foreclosed by the stories that we tell, as well as by the words and names that we use, which are, after all, themselves highly condensed stories. As Donna Haraway, thinking with Marilyn Strathern, reminds us, it matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. In entering into the world of the Millerbird, this lecture considers three interwoven forms of movement, ways in which the Millerbirds are moved, are themselves a form of movement, and might in turn move others. It is, I believe, in the entangled intersections of these forms of movement that the story of this species speaks most powerfully, calling out for renewed practices of attention and care. As such, it's my hope that the story I tell here might contribute in some small way to the continuity of this species and the vital relationships that hold it in the world. That this story might contribute to the kind of ongoingness that the Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group had in mind when they recently gave this species the Hawaiian name Ululu, meaning growing things. So, first section is called Nihoa. The island of Nihoa is, by all accounts, a difficult place to land a boat. Its sheer cliffs rising steeply out of the surrounding ocean. A small, isolated and uninhabited island, Nihoa is the first island that one reaches when travelling out from the main Hawaiian Islands into the vast expanse of the kupuna or ancestor islands, more commonly known as the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. In wild weather, it's simply impossible to land a boat, and trips to Nihoa have to be delayed or cancelled. Even at the best of times, though, landing involves the tricky job of bringing a small boat up alongside a narrow rock ledge and holding it steady in the heaving waves while people clamber out and equipment is unloaded. It was via this difficult route that a small team of scientists arrived on Nihoa in September 2011. Over the rocks they scrambled, carrying not only the food, water and camping equipment they would need, but an assortment of cages, nets and all of the other equipment required to catch and transport 24 millerbirds. Over the next several days the team did just this, spreading out across the rocky, scrubby island to carefully catch the necessary birds. They weighed, banded and monitored them as they did, carefully preparing them for the long journey ahead. The ululu is a small, grey-brown, insectivorous bird, weighing in at a mere 15 grams. As Sheila put it, you might be able to post 2 of them with 1 stamp. In physical appearance, the millerbird is pretty unremarkable, drab even. But all of the people I spoke to who have spent time with these birds seem to have become captivated by them, specifically by the way in which they move through the world. Like many island endemics, unfamiliar with humans and other potential predators, ululu are bold and inquisitive, keen to explore new items or opportunities in the landscape. It's these kinds of behaviours that have allowed these birds to persist on this island with so few resources, an island with no real fresh water, in which only species adapted to harsh, dry, salty, windy conditions can survive. It's in this difficult landscape that these tiny birds have made their homes. Expert hunters and consumers of insects of all kinds, from the smallest fruit flies to the island's trapdoor spiders. Through their bold, resourceful behaviour, these birds remind us that a species is much more than a collection of organisms. Rather, a species is a distinctive way of life, a way of being and of interacting with others. It's this particular embodied way or style of movement that sustains a species across generations, allowing it to endure, to move through evolutionary time. In our present time, however, the particular way of being that is the ululu finds itself threatened. There are at least 2 significant ways in which this species might be rapidly extinguished. Both of these threats are sadly possibilities that are likely to only increase in the coming years. The first is what Sheldon Plentovich, the US Fish and Wildlife Service team leader for this project, referred to in our interview as a catastrophic stochastic event, an extreme weather event like a storm or a hurricane hitting the island, or even a severe drought or fire. Any of these events occurring on a large enough scale at the wrong time might wipe out the whole population and so the species, or reduce it in such a way that it's unable to recover. While these weather events have always happened on Nihoa from time to time, climate change predictions for this part of the Pacific indicate that they're likely to only increase in frequency and intensity. The second looming threat to the ululu takes the form of one of many potentially dangerous new species finding their way to Nihoa. For example, if rats were to become established, as they have done on many other islands in the region, birds' eggs and nestlings would be easy targets. These northwestern or kupuna islands have stringent biosecurity protocols in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But still, there are no guarantees. A single shipwreck or thoughtless island explorer might signal the end of this species. Indeed, rat arrivals have recently been reported on 2 other islands in this chain. It was these kinds of concerns that ultimately grounded the decision to establish a second population of ululu, a backup or security population on another island. And so in 2011 and again in 2012, a small team of scientists relocated about 25 birds each year from Nihoa to Laysan Island, roughly 1,000 kilometres northwest in the same chain. Since at least the early 20th century, but with increased intensity in the last couple of decades, moving species to safer islands has been a core part of Pacific bird conservation, often in response to the pressures of introduced predators. But in recent years, the looming spectre and indeed the lived reality of climate change has been added to this situation. conservationists have started to wonder about the future of even those species that are today relatively healthy. As weather patterns shift, they may simply find themselves without a suitable environment. In this context, some people are beginning to imagine the need for, and indeed to advocate for and actively put into practice, scaled up processes of assisted colonisation. And on the slide are just 4 island projects that fit that bill. But for other people, these projects and proposals go a step too far. The many negative impacts of newly arrived species, not least on islands, have led them to view these projects as unavoidably sowing the seeds for tomorrow's ecological problems. In this larger context, the Uluru represents a relatively uncontroversial assisted colonisation. The new home for the species, Laysan Island, was once itself home to a millerbird. These birds disappeared in the early 20th century, one of the many casualties of the extensive habitat loss that resulted from guano mining and rabbit and other livestock ranching on the island. So the taxonomy is a little debatable, but the Laysan and Nihoa Millerbirds are usually considered to be subspecies rather than unique species. As such, depending on how you look at it, this may not be an assisted colonisation at all. As Sheldon put it, it's an assisted colonisation if you're looking at the subspecific level, but it's just a reintroduction at the species level. This situation led scientists to believe that the Nihoa Millerbird is unlikely to have significant negative impacts on Laysan's ecology. As a species in that environment likely co-evolved with a similar millerbird. In fact, the biologists argued that this reintroduction was likely to have positive impacts. In their words, restoring a piece of Laysan in a way that might recreate functionality within the native ecosystem. Ultimately, however, there can be no guarantees about possible impacts. Small or simply unseen differences between these millerbirds may end up making important differences for local species and ecosystems. More generally, it's important to note that this situation is in stark contrast to most assisted colonisations, in which creating entirely novel ecological relationships is precisely the name of the game. In these cases, decisions have to be made about moving species to new homes in a context where no reassurances can be offered from the past presence of a closely related subspecies. So the term colonisation carries very different meanings, histories, and possibilities in the way in which it's applied to human and other than human contexts. At its core, the term describes the establishment of a group of living beings in a new locale. But for biologists, colonisation does not really imply anything about the consequences of this arrival for the locals already in place. Rather, it describes an inevitable part of the life history of species and the broader patterns of biogeography and evolution. Species move around, they settle in new places. In fact, in some ways the term has a generally positive air about it in biology, denoting not only arrival but successful integration. While the integration may certainly displace or even extinguish other species, biologists tend to use the term invasion, as in the field of invasion biology, to describe more harmful arrivals, especially in contemporary contexts. In this respect, if a species that was the subject of an assisted colonisation were to impact significantly on the ecology of its new home, the colonisation would likely be said to have gone wrong in some sense. In short then, in the biological sciences, the term has none of the connotations of violence, of occupation and displacement that it's gathered up slowly and unevenly over the past decades and centuries in its application to human contexts. But of course, the human and non-human dimensions of colonisation cannot be so neatly separated from each other. At least since Alfred Crosby's ecological imperialism, scholars have been well aware of the way in which the deliberate and accidental movement of plants, animals and diseases of a portmanteau biota have played an essential role in enabling the expansion of colonial empires, not least in the Pacific. Beyond providing material support in everything from their flesh to large-scale processes of environmental and population transformation, relocated plants and animals were also part of the broader settler colonial efforts that aimed to remake their new homes into more familiar, more civilised versions of themselves. This happened in a variety of ways, including through extensive acclimatisation programs that introduced songbirds, ornamental plants, game species and more. This is a process that Anna Boswell describes in Aotearoa, New Zealand as one of grafting a new life world over the existing one. In Hawaii, these entanglements between colonial powers and local people and lands took on a particular form. After European contact in 1778, countless new species rushed into the islands, including diverse crop plants and livestock animals. Initially, these introductions were primarily the prized possessions of the Hawaiian royal family and various elite or nobles. From the early 19th century, however, they became the backbone of a process in which plantations and ranching properties gradually expanded to swallow the islands as more and more land was acquired by outsiders. In 1893, a group of wealthy settlers seized control of the sovereign nation of Hawaii, overthrowing Queen Liliuokalani with the aid and support of members of the United States government and its military. Through a complex series of events, over roughly the next 50 years, Hawaii became a territory and then a state within the US. During this drawn-out process, most Hawaiian people, especially commoners or maka'ainana, lost access to the land, until, in Kealani Kauanui's words, Hawaiians and their descendants became largely a landless people. So at the time of the overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893, the nation of Hawaii was in the process of establishing a renewed relationship with the island of Nihoa, the Millerbirds' home, which had become uninhabited by people about 200 years earlier. Prior to about 1700, though, it's clear from traditional oli, mele and mo'olelo, chants, songs and stories, as well as from archaeological evidence, that Kānaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, frequently visited and likely also lived on Nihoa. There they collected seabirds and their eggs, fished, grew crops and conducted religious rites. In 1822, Queen Ka'ahumanu visited the island and formally annexed it to the kingdom, reconnecting it to the young nation. The respected teacher of Hawaiian language and culture, Pulakea Nogelmeyer, has noted that at a time of considerable social change in the 1820s, this act affirmed the foundations of Hawaiian society, reaching into the distant past to pull into the present an island that was remembered in stories but no longer in personal experience. So significant was this act that for a time buildings and children in the islands were named Nihoa. About 70 years later, however, the kingdom was overthrown, with most Kānaka dispossessed of their land and made subjects of ongoing colonisation. So what does it mean to practice assisted colonisation in a colonised land? The fact that terms like colonisation so often go on leading largely separate lives within discussions of nature and culture is much more than a semantic issue. When we hold these conversations together, we see that there is a subtle and, I think, usually unintended, but nonetheless very real violence to the way in which the term colonisation is used in biology. Not only do stories of biological colonisation emphasise settlement and establishment, while backgrounding the displacement and death that frequently accompany any such movement, they are also often tinged with a progressive aura, stories of struggle and success in new lands. But of course, Indigenous peoples are telling very different stories with this same word, stories that have long had to struggle against precisely this kind of erasure in the name of progress. As such, it seems essential that all colonisation, human or non-human, assisted or otherwise, be understood as a process that is necessarily both constructive and destructive, opening up and foreclosing possibilities for different ways of life. Doing so forces us to inquire seriously into the always unequal dynamics of life and death inside biocultural multi-species contact zones. More broadly, however, situating the possibility of relocating species in a colonised land requires us to ask who is entitled to make decisions about these island environments to establish new forms of life in new places, and under what processes. In the case of the Uluru, this assisted colonisation took place as part of the broader management of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. The management of this monument includes Kānaka Maoli representation in various ways, including the cultural working group that provided the millerbird with its Hawaiian name. A key part of the work that these committees do is to promote and facilitate an ongoing interaction with the Kupuna Islands as a dynamic cultural heritage. This involves celebrating their rich past, but also engaging in activities like bringing traditional cultural practitioners out into the islands so that they might craft new knowledges about these places, alongside new oli, mele and mo'olelo. Again, that's chants, songs and stories. In this way, the management of the monument aims to build the kinds of relationships that nurture people and the aina, or the land, into the future. As Tai Kavika Tengen has noted, Kānaka Maoli have always made and remade their identities through the remembering and retelling of mo'olelo, especially in times of rapid change that threaten their continued existence as a people. One of the cultural practitioners who's joined these voyages to the Kupuna Islands to weave new stories into and out of this place was Kodi Pueo Pata, a distinguished kumu hula, teacher of hula. In our discussions, Pueo emphasised the vital role that stories, new and old, and the intimate knowledge of the islands that they contain must play in the context of a long and ongoing history of colonisation. Pueo works as an educator at Papahanakua on Oahu, and in the words of that organisation, a school, an aina-based or land-based learning organisation that's connecting the area's past with a sustainable future. Pueo explained to me that his work with his students is grounded in the understanding that if they don't have a sense of pride in or responsibility to this place and a good foundation in Hawaiian identity, there's not that much that's keeping them here. About 8 residents of Hawaii leave every day to move to another place because it's so expensive here. And to be honest, there's not really a connection for many people to place anymore, unless they were raised in a traditional family. Sam Ohugon, a biologist and kumu oli, a teacher of chants, expressed a similar understanding and challenge. As he put it, the vast majority of people are trying to feed their families, pay their rent. He went on to say, it's a tough thing when people that were once so closely tied to their environment and their species no longer know and no longer care about them. It's a mission among many people to rebuild those connections between people, place, and the elements of place. But we're not there yet, and we need to be. End quote. So the reconnection work that Pueo and Sam are describing, connecting to place through story, is an ongoing process in Hawaii today, as it perhaps always is, but taking on new forms in the wake of colonisation. As Carly Fernandez has noted, in Hawaii today, Native Hawaiians find ourselves literally and figuratively out of place. Such displacement can be countered through conscious acts of replacement, of reconnecting to Hawaiian ways of knowing and being that are rooted in place. In this context, reconnection work must also be an important aspect of considering assisted colonisation in this colonised land, asking how these movements of birds, as well as the stories that we tell about them, might contribute to or undermine efforts to acknowledge the past and craft and celebrate meaningful relationships and connections. Relationships and connections that can hold open, generate and protect possibilities for what Noelani Goodyear Kaupua has described as multiplicitous indigenous futurities. To Laysan. With the ululu loaded on board, the ship set sail from Nihoa to Laysan. Keeping tiny insectivorous birds in good health in captivity is a challenging thing to do, especially on a ship. Millerbirds don't have much body weight to play with, so their diet and health need to be constantly monitored and managed. It took about 3 days to make the journey. On arrival, the delicate cargo of birds was carefully offloaded, each weighed and their health evaluated. All of them seemed to have made the trip well, so the team decided to proceed with the planned release. Laysan is a long, skinny, relatively flat island. At its centre, running most of the length of the island, is a huge hypersaline lake. The selected release site for the ululu was at the northern end of this lake, in a large expanse of vegetation dominated by the naupaka plant. As you can see there, it's my second favourite Hawaiian plant. Although these birds have never encountered this particular plant before, they settled in right away, quickly beginning to establish and defend territories. But despite appearances, Laysan is far from being an ideal new home for the ululu. Decades of work by conservationists have revegetated the island and removed the introduced rabbits and other livestock that played an important role in driving the island's previous millerbird inhabitants to extinction. As a result, Laysan is in a much healthier state than it has been for almost 100 years. The question, however, is how long it will remain this way. The spectre of climate change hangs over this island too. Unlike on the relatively high island of Nihoa, though, on Laysan it's thought that sea level rise is going to present real challenges for continued life. Dynamic inundation modelling indicates that with sea level rise of just 1 to 2 metres, the majority of the island's millerbird habitat will likely be lost. So too will major breeding grounds for a range of threatened seabirds. None of this is news to the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They have explicitly noted that creating a second population of millerbirds on Laysan is a short-term solution. They're buying time. As Sheldon put it to me, obviously Laysan wouldn't be the best choice because it's a low island, and models predict that the island is going to have washover events, where the waves wash over the entire island within about 100 years. We were very cognizant of that, but it was the best option. The prior presence of millerbirds on Laysan is of course a key part of the appeal of moving these birds there. But there's more to the story than this. Laysan was also the best option because there are just so few others. While there are several higher islands in Hawaii, principally the main islands that comprise the state, all of them are home to introduced rats and disease-carrying mosquitoes. If ululu were introduced on any of these islands, they would likely be quickly extinguished by a combination of predation by rats and avian malaria and pox. Indeed, these threats are so pervasive that the high islands can no longer really offer a suitable habitat for any of Hawaii's endemic forest birds. Of the 42 species of forest birds left, 31 are federally listed under the US Endangered Species Act. Almost all of those species that remain have been pushed into the higher elevation forests where cooler temperatures inhibit the development of both mosquito larvae and the malaria parasite. With a changing climate, however, mosquitoes are moving higher and higher into these last refugia. Discussing this dire situation with me, Sheldon noted that, in her view, Hawaii's ecosystems are not unravelling, they're already largely unravelled. This is the context in which Laysan was selected as the best available home for a new population of ululu. Alongside the ongoing threats of predation and habitat loss, today a warming climate is causing rising sea levels and rising mosquitoes, further threatening remaining forest and seabirds. So while Laysan cannot offer a long-term future for the species, conservationists hope that it might buy them enough time for alternatives of one kind or another to emerge. The seas were unseasonably calm in 2012 for the voyage that took the second group of ululu between Nihoa and Laysan. Shortly after this auspicious trip, the Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument decided to give this new population its own distinctive Hawaiian name. They settled on Ululu Niau, Niau meaning moving smoothly, swiftly, silently, peacefully, flowing or sailing thus. In this name they captured a hope that this act of movement might contribute to the ongoing growth of the species that the name ululu describes and invokes. These acts of naming carry with them the powerful potential to reweave relationships with birds and indeed islands, to not only hold these connections in the world, but to thicken and vitalise them. But as Puakea Noblemeyer pointed out to me in an interview, only if naming is taken up with care. In our discussion, Puakea emphasised that formal processes of naming that are a key part of the dynamic, ongoing life of Olelo Hawaii, or of the Hawaiian language. Equally, however, he noted, we must pay close attention to the names used in the past. He said, the new words are a sign of vitality, the old words of strength. Both are needed. In addition to its ongoing oral culture, Hawaii has a phenomenal archive of historical newspapers and other documents in Olelo Hawaii. Very soon after the arrival of the printing press in the islands with Christian missionaries, Hawaii became perhaps the most literate nation on earth, and Kānaka Maoli set up their own newspapers to record and preserve their own histories and stories. There are over 1 million standard pages worth of printed text in this archive. Puakea worries that sometimes the work has not been done to search these archives for an old name, for birds or even for whole islands, before new names are selected. In his view, giving Hawaiian names is an easy thing to do, looking for old ones less so. He explained to me, "We're facing a century of disconnect. The language was not being kept fresh at a time of great change. If an effort has really been made to find a reference and there isn't one, then it's very important to bring it in to provide a Hawaiian name. But the work of looking for an old name first is important. Creating new names where there are already old ones will mean, in his words, creating a future that is disconnected." He asked, "Will coming generations be able to read their own history?" So Puakea's provocation, I think, brings to the fore the real possibility that Uluru were once known by another name. The island of Nihoa, after all, has a long and diverse set of connections to Hawaiian life. Does an old name for the millerbird still linger in an archive, or even a living memory somewhere? Perhaps not lost, but rather misplaced, lying in wait for those who would search carefully. To pose these questions is not to diminish the importance of a well-given Hawaiian name, its capacity to shape relationships and worlds in profound ways, but rather simply to note some of the important potentials for both reconnection and disconnection that reside in names, in the particular words that are strung together in succession to form our stories. It's the final section. 7 years after their introduction, the Ululu Niau, the birds living on Laysan, are doing very well. From an original founding population of 50, there are now thought to be several hundred birds. As millerbirds only live for about 7 years, almost all of these birds will actually have been hatched into the world on Laysan. For many years, the population packed more and more tightly into the large patch of Naupaka that the original birds were released into. Just a couple of years ago, though, they started to spread out more, finding new parts of the island to call home. They are that rare but much hoped for result of an assisted colonisation, a breeding, self-sustaining population. Part of me celebrates the fact that these resourceful little birds have, at least for now, been made more secure in the world. In contrast to so many other species at the present time, the millerbird has taken a decisive step away from, rather than towards, extinction. But another part of me can't let go of the fact that this is such an uncertain and ambivalent situation. We just don't know how long Laysan will remain a livable island for these birds. It's hard to believe it'll be more than 100 years though. Laysan is not an ideal new home. It's not even an improvement on Nihoa. In all likelihood, the new population will be lost before the old one. None of this is to say that these birds ought not to have been moved. In fact, the more I learned about this particular case, the more I found myself supporting the efforts of these passionate people who have taken on this work. Rather than rejecting this approach, my concern here is simply that success not be reduced to the work of buying time. Without the larger systemic changes that will actually make a difference for the species, foremost amongst them effective action on climate change, buying time becomes nothing more than a process of delaying the inevitable, drawing out the death of yet one more species. The sad reality is that we're losing the kind of world that might accommodate the millerbird. Between the rats, the mosquitoes, the rising sea levels and the increased extreme weather events, they're being squeezed out of the world. Of course, this is true of so many species today. Many of Hawaii's terrestrial and seabirds are in a similar, if not worse, situation. As Anna Singh and Donna Haraway have noted, our Anthropocene epoch is one that is generally characterised by the destruction of places and times of refuge for people and other critters. But there's something about the millerbird story that makes the unravelling of this species' world somehow more apparent, more palpable. My suspicion is that this understanding is closely connected to the act of moving birds, of assisted colonisation. Perhaps it's only when we feel that when we free ourselves to ask where else might they go, that we can see the full scale and significance of our current predicament. The Ululu's problem is not only that their particular island environment is likely to become increasingly unlivable, but rather that all of those other places that they might reasonably inhabit have already been made similarly or indeed more inhospitable. In short, by raising the possibility of movement, we see that there's nowhere left to go. To the extent that this is the case for a single species like the Ululu, things are made infinitely more difficult when we consider the vast number of species that will likely become candidates for being moved around the world in the coming years. With all of this in mind, it's hard not to feel that the millerbirds of Laysan cannot be understood as an exemplar of a bold new conservation paradigm. They do not so much signify a new future as they do the desperateness of the current situation, and so the dire need to address its underlying causes. We're literally shuffling species around the earth with all of the risks, impacts and costs that this entails to, in many cases, buy them a handful of years. To describe the world of the Ululu as one that is unravelling is to point to the breakdown of the relationships, the landscapes, the contexts that once nourished and sustained the ongoingness of this way of life, this movement through evolutionary time. It is to describe a process of unworlding. In contrast to the more spectacular and obvious violence of direct killing, this unravelling is often more insidious and drawn out. The suffocation, erasure, undermining, overwriting of the conditions of life. This is so much the case that, like the slow violence that Rob Nixon describes, it often doesn't appear to be a form of violence at all. In other work, I've described the way in which all extinction takes the form of an unravelling of worlds that begins long before the death of the last individual and continues long afterwards. In these cases, my emphasis was on the way in which extinctions give rise to processes of unravelling, rippling out into the world to impact on diverse cultural and ecological relationships. In the context of the Ululu, however, we see that the connection between extinction and unravelling is much less linear, much less unidirectional. Here it is the loss of a world that in many ways precipitates a possible extinction. There's a different kind of spectrality at work in these processes in which a species, a form of life, lingers, at least for a time, as its world is undone around it. The process of unworlding that I'm describing here is one that frequently goes by the name of colonisation. At least it does when the forms of life at stake are recognised as being human. As Diana Heath notes, colonialism is a violation of the world of the colonised, which entails a process of unworlding. A process in which relationships and systems, economic, social, legal and more, are undone and redone. It's a process, in other words, in which the worlds that sustain the ongoingness of particular forms of life are overwritten through diverse forms of more or less visible, spectacular and systematic violence. In Hawaii, as Jonathan Osorio has noted, the colonisation of Kānaka Maoli lives and lands worked through a slow, insinuating invasion of people, ideas and institutions. These processes undermined and prohibited the use of Olelo Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, as well as hula and diverse other expressions and practices of Hawaiian culture. While, as Osorio and many other scholars have documented, many Kānaka Maoli resisted, fighting this invasion with perplexity and courage, ultimately, that colonialism literally and figuratively dismembered the lahui, the people, from their traditions, their lands, and ultimately their government. The process of dismemberment that Osorio describes is readily recognisable, I think, as one of unworlding, one in which a way of life is undermined through the destruction of its world, its systems of meaning, relating, and nourishment. To name the violence of unworlding a species like the Ululu as colonisation is, in a sense, to even further complicate the confusing biocultural connotations of this term. Perhaps as we move ever more deeply into the Earth's sixth mass extinction event, we need another name for these relentless processes of unravelling other species' worlds. Perhaps to think about climate change and large-scale habitat destruction as the colonisation of animal and plant lives and futures only confuses the issue. Equally as concerning, perhaps such a framing diminishes the ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples, many of whom are all too familiar with the dangers of being considered under the same rubrics as flora and fauna. Or on the other hand, perhaps this naming helps us to see the thoroughly entangled natural cultural dimensions of all of those processes of violence, displacement, and overwriting that are gathered together here. As Deborah Bird-Rose has frequently noted, genocide and ecocide often travel hand in hand. From such a perspective, we can see that it's precisely because we, some of us, have colonised these islands, perhaps colonised the planet and its future, that the assisted colonisation of the Uluru is both so necessary and so profoundly difficult and unlikely to succeed in the long term. There is, however, a problematic politics to these declarations of unravelling or disappearing worlds. Frequently such declarations function as political and ethical devices. Imaginations of what was or still is, but only just, are enrolled to speak to the present. All too often, Indigenous peoples and their environments get bundled up together in these discussions, the inevitable demise of one signalling the death of the other. In these cases, the rich, even if threatened, lives and possibilities of people and places slip from view. But as Matt Hooley asks, what do narratives of disappearing worlds themselves disappear? What do they make legible only as disappearance? In recent years, climate change, and in particular rising sea levels, have become key aspects of these narratives. Discussing media and environmentalist portrayals of Tuvalu, Carol Farbotko describes what she calls a narrative of wishful sinking, in which the small island nation is lost beneath the waves as a message to the rest of the world that we must act on climate change. My account of the unravelling worlds of the Uluru risks falling into these kinds of narrative traps. Certainly I'm mindful of the ethics of putting Uluru to work to make more general points about extinction, colonisation and climate change. But I don't think these narratives of disappearance are always to be strictly avoided, nor are they the only ones that do dangerous disappearing work. Stories of hope and success can equally do this work. Instead, what I've tried to offer is a story of the Uluru and other species, including diverse peoples, a story about loss and a celebration of what has been and might still endure. Likewise, my intention is certainly not to suggest that Kānaka Maoli and their ways of life are themselves in decline. To understand colonisation as a violent unworlding is not to suggest that these processes have always succeeded in this effort. Rather, as Marisol de la Cadena notes, ongoing colonising efforts to destroy heterogeneous indigenous worlds are simultaneously stories of the destruction of these worlds and the impossibility of such destruction. And yet it remains the case that amongst the many consequences of the incredible loss of birds in Hawaii is a profound and ongoing impact on Kānaka Maoli. On a recent trip to Hawaii, I was reminded by Sam Ohugon that the iiwi, a beautiful red honey creeper that is now on the endangered species list, is the last living connection to the long tradition of Hawaiian featherwork, all of the other key bird species having already been lost, including the o'o, which we heard about earlier today. Pueo Pata told me about the way in which the loss of plants and animals profoundly impacts on traditional religious practices. The use of parts of plants and animals, like feathers, sustainably harvested through catch and release, is a key part of traditional hula. As Pueo explained, the feathered gods are no longer possible if they require the yellow feathers of the o'o bird or the mamo, which are both now extinct. We can never recreate or resurrect that part of the religion. He went on to note, we can never put foreign plants or animals on our kuahu, our altar. They're not our akua, our gods. They're not the body forms of our ancestors. If we no longer have access to the body forms of our ancestors, to our akua, that form of worship stops. Without doubt, these are intimate and profound relationships, but there's no simple correlation between the loss of birds and the loss of people and their culture. Although, as Sam pointed out to me, these processes did occur hand in hand in the early days of US colonisation. While species have continued to be lost at a staggering rate in recent decades, this same period has seen an incredible renaissance of Hawaiian language, culture and politics. The roles taken up by Kānaka Maoli in the naming and management of species like the ululu are just one small example of this. The broader ongoing work of invigorating connection to culture, to aina, that is taking place all across the islands is showing that, like at least some of the old names, things thought lost by some may yet endure, may linger and remain, may be recovered with care. I hope that this is also true of the ululu and Hawaii's other birds, but it seems increasingly less likely that their worlds can be recovered, ravelled together in old or new ways that might sustain them. Acknowledging this broader context of unworlding is essential to the possibility of moving birds responsibly. Doing so requires that we tell the story of the ululu in ways that do not allow it to become divorced from the larger patterns of both renewal and loss at work here. In the official public-facing information booklet of the 30-minute documentary about the Ululu project, we are offered an account of an unmitigated success. A great job is done here of linking these islands and the Ululu to Kānaka Maoli history and culture, summoning up important possibilities for reconnection. But there's no mention whatsoever of climate change, of rising sea levels and increased storms, of the deeply uncertain future of Laysan Island and its new Ululu population. We need to get better at telling stories of ambivalent success, tales of what Singh has called gardening in the ruins, of dedicated care and achievement that are nonetheless tinged with the unavoidable uncertainty of our Anthropocene epoch. This assisted colonisation was an ambivalent success not because the plan didn't work out, but rather because the world in which we live is one in which the best plans, the best options, are now often so far from ideal, or even from what might have been possible a few decades ago. And so while the Ululu story is undoubtedly one of success, it's simultaneously a profound tragedy, acted out across an ocean, a tragedy that, if we're paying attention, must summon us into new modes of responsibility. In the coming years, we'll need to ask again and again, is assisted colonisation the right course of action here? And if so, when and where to, and who should decide? These are all vitally important questions, but they're not enough. Moving birds will never be enough. We must also be moved by them, affected, put into motion by the tragedy of so many unravelling worlds. If we, whoever that we turns out to be, are to responsibly take on this work, then we must do so in a way that engages with the complexities of colonisation, of violent unworlding in their diverse historical and ongoing formations. As such, while I sincerely hope that the movement of the Ululu has bought the species a little more time, my more solemn hope is that the story of this species, tangled up as it is with so many other threatened forms of life, might help to set in motion those more substantial changes that are vitally needed to sustain all of our futures. Thank you.
This brilliant talk. It really sort of deftly wove together all kinds of threads about species and histories, conservation, and the meaning of assisted colonization, which is something that's brand new to me. So there's a number of people probably that like to have questions asked. For those in the back, if you wouldn't mind projecting your questions so that people in the front can hear, and likewise people in the front, if you wouldn't mind projecting so people in the back can hear. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Would anyone like to kick it off? If not, I do have one little question. You mentioned that your second favorite Hawaiian plant. I need to know about the first. Like, what's your most favorite Hawaiian plant?
It's an obvious one too. It's up here.
Okay.
It's got a red blossom.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, I just want to thank you for that really fascinating, really phenomenal talk. I have, I guess, just like a could you tell us more kind of question. I guess I'm curious. So I'm backing up. Your talk reminded me a lot of Leanne Simpson's writing about colonization as a severing of relations and how decolonizing work is in part a work of coming up with new relationships within like Western modernity, right? That aren't predicated on extractive behaviors, that are about reformulating relations, and sort of rebuilding these more dynamic and more intimate relations to the natural world. And she, of course, is working from a very specific place as an Indigenous writer. So just with that in mind, I'm curious, are there any decolonizing or like anti-colonial groups that are using either this example or other sort of species reintroduction practices as part of like a bigger reframing or sort of resistance against ecocide and historical genocide?
Wow, that's a really great question, and I have trouble ever thinking of examples off the top of my head. I'd like a few minutes to think about it. I won't take them up here. So yeah, I can't. Nothing pops to mind, but I'm sure there must be. Yeah, nothing is springing to mind immediately. But, I will get back to you on that, and probably other people in the audience will have examples. Yeah. Sorry.
Question for Jane?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated the care with which you did your work in the islands on so many levels, having spent a lot of time in Honolulu. I wonder if you could talk about some of the other populations in the islands, because you've concentrated on the Native Hawaiian connection, the way you structured your talk. In terms of this type of practice, what are you finding on the ground in terms of other populations, like especially the quote local population and the sort of complex demographic histories of the majority of people in the islands?
Well, this is a side project for me, if you like. Not working in Hawaii, that's sort of is one of the main places I've been working, but Ululu and assisted colonisation is sort of is a new project for me. So I'm and a side project to my main project on Hawaiian snails at the moment. So I haven't actually done that much research exploring wider ideas about assisted colonisation, and in particular, I guess, because this case is taking place out in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, where no one really lives, or very few people live, and for that reason it sort of makes this a much less controversial effort to move things around. In the longer version of this paper, I explore how it probably shouldn't be less controversial, at least as regards Indigenous politics and history, but in practical terms it has been a lot less controversial. So, but with regard to other kinds of assisted colonisation with other species, I guess those have more directly impacted on people. And maybe the best example, or the most obvious example, is the new seabird enclosures that are trying to encourage breeding of seabirds on islands like Oahu, higher islands, to get them away from places like Laysan that currently have a huge proportion of the global population of species like the Laysan and black-footed albatross. And there I think, it's been, in that particular case, been not very controversial at all, and widely supported, and I think largely because it's been done inside existing conservation areas. So other work that I've done that's been looking at putting things back, I guess, is not really assisted colonisation. It would depend who you ask, but things like re-releasing forest birds that's involved much more environmental management, fencing and exclusion of ungulates and things like that. Things get much more contentious. So I guess the general takeaway is that moving things around tends to create new social complexities, to use a crude dualism, in addition to new ecological ones. And I think that's only really just starting to be grappled with, and it's going to be a big coming problem, I think, as assisted colonisation becomes more and more common as a technique for managing climate change, which I think is sort of inevitable.
Actually, I was kind of curious, is rewilding and assisted colonization somewhat related? Is it the same thing, or is that just a semantic issue?
I think there's probably lots of crossovers, and I don't think they wouldn't be the same thing, but then there's lots of different ways in which people are using rewilding, and there's lots of different sort of subcategories of assisted colonisation. So, yeah, I think it's a semantic thing.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yeah,
Yeah, just thank you so much for this talk. It's very nice as a new scholar in extinction studies to have the opportunity to listen to you. I wonder with this existent colonisation, if how much the community is involved in indigenous people, because I often find, coming from the heritage field, that this, when you take away objects and culture, there'll always be this resistance because of the colonial history, and often also because people are not involved in this action, even though they are coming from a good heart, conservation practice. So I wonder if there's any, if these people also include community work within these practices. That makes sense.
In this particular case, not really, because of it happening in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands where there aren't people, except insofar as representative groups are involved, like the Native Hawaiian committees of the Marine National Monument. But in some of those other cases I was talking about, there is really extensive community involvement, or the normal kinds of community impact statements and things like that, which sometimes go some way to alleviating the tensions, but very imperfectly.
But does it compromise from the outside, or do you also see the indigenous people coming up with their own way of preserving extinction? Or is there any maybe it's a little bit like what you're saying actually.
You're
coming from
articulating it
the,
perhaps better than I was, but I guess it goes back to that question of motivation, community involvement, and sort of how it can be used as like a community
and the decolonization instead of this anti-colonization.
Yeah, none of the projects that I've looked at in Hawaii have had that sort of characteristic. They've all been US Fish and Wildlife Service sort of driven projects, or which is federal, or state driven projects, or they've been pet projects of particular conservationists that have become that have moved in, got funding and become bigger. None of them have been that kind of a grassroots project. I think you definitely do see other, well, I shouldn't say that. There's one that I'm currently working on with the snails that is a very grassroots led project by a group called Malama Makua, who are trying to reclaim a valley, the Makua Valley on Oahu, which has been used as a live fire training area by the US military for about 100 years. And they have effectively blocked, through court cases, the military using that valley for those purposes for a couple of decades now. And part of the story of that is that there are a lot of endangered Hawaiian snails in the valley, and those snails have been integral to the court case activities. So that is a case of that connects to larger issues around not only sovereignty, but homelessness and the cost of living, and all of these other issues in Hawaii that often impact a lot on the Native Hawaiian community. So I think a case like that, but there's with the people I talk to there's a lot of real care and concern for the snails, but I guess they sort of came, I think they came a little bit later. The real issue, the foundational issue for them is land. I think that's often the case, and that's not divorced from endangered species, but it's the way that I thought a lot of the environmental issues are framed at the grassroots level in Hawaii, at least in my limited experiences around land and sovereignty, and endangered species are just sort of part of that package, which I think does often conflict with the way the Endangered Species Act, for example, works. Yeah.
So to build on that question about land then, is there something particular, do you think, about islands that make unworlding happen at a faster rate or on a greater scale?
Lots of things, particularly about islands. They're fascinating. And I'm hoping this paper is part of a book that's thinking about concepts in biogeography, colonisation being one of them, in this, others being things like isolation and distance and naivety. I'm really interested in how it's applied to people and island species. So rethinking those concepts in a contemporary sort of biocultural context. And yes, those are all islandy things. So I think there's a combination of really high levels of endemism, really high rates of extinction, really small places where stuff's thrown together, and somewhere like Hawaii, incredibly high costs of living and demands on the land for tourism, military, agriculture. So yeah, then Hawaii in particular, but I guess islands more generally, are real melting pots of beauty, interest, but also challenge. Yeah.
We do have time for one more question.
Maybe
Maybe
somebody
two.
else has one, just go.
We have maybe one and then two. Lucinda? Go ahead first.
Okay. Well, I have actually, I think, a difficult question. It's a question that I've been asking myself. And it kind of follows up from your call to think about the sort of deeper systemic problem. And as you know, there's been a number of demonstrations and civil disobedience actions in the UK calling for a climate emergency to be declared. And I, in the University of Kent, and there's been a number of universities who have declared climate emergencies, a number of councils, and of course what's happened when people declare a climate emergency is that they go, oh my God, now what do we do? You know, what do we need to do to cut emissions drastically by 2025, right? And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves, because like you, I presume, our own work is premised on these long distance flights, is what responsibility do we have to kind of think about this in terms of our own practice? So I'm thinking from your position, particularly because in order for anybody to go to Hawaii, they have to become complicit in creating the emissions. If you have any thoughts, is this something that other scholars in other places are also contemplating? What would you, I mean, it's a very unfair question. But I'm just curious, because I think it's something more people are going to be asking us. A number of students have been asking me this question. And so I just thought it would be an interesting thing to kind of hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have any good thoughts, I think, beyond the thoughts that probably all of us have about how to minimise travel, and my next project is at home, which I'm really looking forward to for both carbon reasons and all sorts of other reasons. So yeah, I think it's challenging. I'm not prepared to give it up. I think there's a real value to doing work, field work, especially outside of where you live, and so I think for me, it's just, all I can say is how I've approached it personally, which is to try and minimise, to try and make fewer long trips, to make fewer trips and have them be longer, and eventually, I guess, to move to doing more around my home. But I find by and large that the scholars of mine who do similar things have just shifted the burden of travel onto their colleagues, because they no longer travel, and they want other people to come to them. So I think we need better approaches than that, and I don't have any good simple answer. But thanks.
Let's finish with Lucinda.
Oh, okay. Well, you kept saying over and over again, or maybe I just heard it over, and success should not be viewed as buying time, which something that, you know, that it really, that strikes me as being so true. And I'm wondering if this focus on island ecologies is, if that has somehow given us a false sense of success that may or may not translate into larger systemic change. And so I guess I'm asking, do you think that the focus on, you know, the recolonization and within island ecologies, it has been positive, neutral, negative in terms of affecting that systemic change?
The refocus on what, sorry?
On the island ecologies and the, you know, recolonization, saving, you know, specific species.
Do do you mean the focus amongst the conservation community
Yeah.
on islands?
Yeah.
I don't know. So I guess I work mostly on islands. I guess people who don't work on islands might not say there was a focus on islands. I mean, so I think there are some ways in which we're very focused on islands because they have high rates of endemism and high rates of loss. There are other ways in which conservation biology is just thoroughly continent-centric in its thinking and its management, and islands are constantly struggling to try and, especially islands like Hawaii that are governed from, to some extent, Washington, are constantly struggling with the fact that islands are not part of the thinking. I mean, somewhere like Hawaii that has, I think, the majority of the US's endangered species and a fraction of the budget and a fraction of the representation at the government level, and places like the Marianas that I've also worked in, situations even worse, both in terms of representation and budget. So I think islands are forgotten a lot of the time.
Really?
So yeah, I'm not sure. I think they're really interesting places, and so they become really paradigmatic places for people to talk about and to talk about Darwin and all of those typical things. But in the day-to-day world of conservation, I think that they're usually forgotten places. So does that answer your question?
It leads to one I'll ask you later. Thank
Okay.
you. That was brilliant.
Please join me in thanking